On behalf of my family, let me thank the church, thank the many friends of our family who are here and have supported my mom especially. Thank you very much from the bottom of our hearts. Very good, Dad. That's what I'd like to entitle my brief reflections. Dad was the son of William Spencer Cheek and Evie Mason. He was throughout his life a faithful person. He never questioned his belief in the risen Lord. My grandfather was working at Forsyth Chair Company in 1928. They rented a house on Geneva Street. Rick and I took Dad there a couple years ago. When Dad was born on the 8th of January 1928, it snowed 1.5 feet. That's what everybody remembered in the family, especially my grandfather. And Dad always told me they moved every month, which I thought was very interesting given the challenges that moving involves. I asked my grandfather, why do they move every month? And he said, always remember that the rent is due at the end of the month. In many ways, the Cheek family was the hardscrabble world of Appalachia, transplanted to what the sociologists and anthropologists call Trans-Appalachia, the cities that grew up and expanded and attracted the populations from Appalachia. By the time he was in the first grade, he went to Oak Summit School, which I was told last night doesn't exist anymore, in Winston-Salem. It was during the Depression. Cows ran free. Pigs ran around without restriction. The house was heated by a fireplace. In many ways, Dad's early life was defined by the Great Depression in the South. The whole family had to share food. Mother and father raised most of that food, almost all of it. Going to the store was a rare event. And Dad used to tell me about Christmas in the early 1930s, in the late 1920s, where they all got an orange, and on a good year, a piece of peppermint. Our grandfather drove a Model A, so Dad knew the history of American automobiles. Our grandfather was a moonshiner, or really more of a driver, what we would call in the 21st century a practitioner of moonshine logistics. His Wilkes County to Winston-Salem run was its own version of Thunder Road. And the revenuers, which is a term that we still use without much affection in our family, were well known to him. In fact, my grandfather had the nickname among his moonshining colleagues as White Lightning, signifying his ability to evade the authorities. On his off days, our grandpa would take our dad, who was a little bitty boy, to collect coins from slot machines. Dad had great math skills, which all the way from algebra to differential equations. When he was an engineer at Western Electric, he took a trig class, advanced trigonometry class at Wake Forest, and the professor said, you made the highest grade ever. And the final exam that Dad always liked to tell us about was a pool table, and the only piece of information he was given was the movement of one ball and the speed of that, and he had to figure out the equation. These are skills he passed on to my brother, but not to me. He spent the first and 8th grades at Oak Summit, and then he went to Mineral Springs for the 9th and 12th. He failed the first grade, not because he was poor academic, but because he had spinal meningitis, just like his brother Tom did, and they had it together, and the survival rate was really quite low. So it's a miracle and a sign of God's grace that they survived. Dad was an example of the Puritan work ethic. He began working in 1939 as an 11-year-old boy at Pulliam's Barbecue. He was what he called a runner. They would place an order, he would go take the order and turn it in, and I guess deliver it. His mother would take them there, but only after Sunday school. She was a very holy lady. And he worked his way up. Mr. Pulliam provided for him an example of a magnanimous human being, because Mr. Pulliam would give people time off when they needed it. If he made a lot of money one week, he would share that money with other people, including Dad, and that meant a lot to Dad. He went on to Mineral Springs High School, where in his freshman year, they won the state championship. Dad traveled a lot because he was a great athlete. He lettered in 3 sports for 4 years. He was an amazing baseball player. When he graduated from high school in 1947, numerous colleges asked him to come play for us, what we now call High Point University, the Citadel. He went to the Citadel. He said, "Oh, those guys, that's too rough. I don't want to go there. You know, you don't even get to play baseball very much. You have to march and things like that." Little did he know what he would experience himself. Later on, he'd be drafted by the St. Louis Cardinals and assigned to their 2A team in Rollo, Missouri. Dad said, "I'm not going to Missouri. My place is at home. My place is at North Carolina." And many of us are forever grateful for that piece of wisdom. He worked from 1947 to 1950 at Western Electric as a very accomplished toolmaker. In 1950, he was drafted. And Dad would serve in the United States Army, the 5th Army, from 1950 to 1952. He went to basic training at Fort Jackson, which is, if you've never been there, is one of the most miserable places God ever created. And while he was there was a engineer colonel by the name of Colonel Ralph Bell. Ralph Bell looked through all the files of the soldiers who were there, and he picked out a handful of people based upon their skills. According to Dad, he looked and he saw that he grew up on a farm, knew how to drive a tractor, and he also could make tools, and he said, "I got to have the cheap guy at Fort Leonard Wood." So he took Dad out to Fort Leonard Wood with a handful of people, and they reopened that fort because it had been closed in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. Dad was an exemplary soldier. He volunteered to go to Korea. But Colonel Ralph Bell said, "I need you here, Red, because you can handle whatever I give you." Dad, a passive gentleman, was a drill sergeant. He was a real drill sergeant. He went through basic training 15 times. Not because he was a remedial student, but because he was so darn good at training other people. And Ralph Bell, at the end of his tour of duty, said, "Red, I'm sending you to officer candidate school. We'd like for you to be an officer." Dad said, "Well, maybe I'll be a warrant officer." He said, "No, you've got a bright career in the military." Dad said, "No, I'm going home to North Carolina, and I'm going to marry Ann." And they had 60 years of marriage, an exemplary model of Christian marriage. And 10 years ago, we celebrated their 50th anniversary right here. And now we celebrate the life that they had together for 60 years, which would have been impossible and much less blissful without my mom. And a great example and a metaphor for Dad's life was in 1951. General Mark Clark, probably one of the most famous military leaders of the Second World War in 20th century America, inspected a whole brigade at Fort Leonard Wood. Over 1,000 soldiers. And Dad's military bearings were so good in terms of keeping his uniform straight, his rifle, that he was a very special soldier. Mark Clark went down the line, looked at every soldier's uniform, every soldier's gun. When he came to Dad, he said, "Very good, soldier." That is really Dad's lesson for us, is to give it all you can, as well as you can. And that's what we say to you today, Dad. Very good. Thank you for the life that you have lived and what you've shared with us. Dad went on to return to Western Electric. He worked from 1947 to 1955 at the Chatham Road plant, known to many people here this morning, and from 1955 until he retired in 1986 at the Lexington Road plant. Early in his career, he was nominated by his boss, a fellow by the name of Charlie Wolf, for the toolmaker's course, and became an expert toolmaker. It's because of this experience that the higher-ups picked up Dad, a fellow by the name of Hank Snyder, who had been part of what they call the Hawthorne experience. One of the great experiences of American management is that we need guys like Red Cheek in that, and so Dad became part of a kind of specialized group. Early on, he was a steward, union steward, but he would change his mind of union stewards. Before it was politically correct to do so, Dad would help young guys who had problems. One of them was a young African-American gentleman by the name of Humphrey, who was the best driver at the Lexington Road plant, but he was not allowed to drive other people. Dad, as union steward, lobbied and made sure that he got the job as the camp as a company chauffeur, which would have been prohibited to him. And Dad was very proud that he was able to help Humphrey, and they remained friends for many years. In 1953, Mother and Father married. My grandmother Clinch thought he was too old for her. He was 5 years older. They lived on Cleveland Avenue and Stires Road, and then they moved to Elm Drive and North Winston-Salem, and that's where Rick and I spent our early years of our life. Mom and Dad had a model marriage that continues to teach me what a Christian marriage is like, and reminds us all, I never once heard my mother or father shout at each other in 60 years. No thrown objects that I saw, and I'm sure there weren't any. This is a model of cooperation, mutual love, that is a model for all of us. In 1986, Dad retired, mainly because his back kept getting worse and worse, but he stayed active. And as Pinnacle and Shoals were as much of his home as any place he ever lived, anybody he ever knew. He loved his church, he loved the Ruithin Club, he loved his engineer group that would hang out, but he was somewhat reluctant. Dad was raised in a what we call a free church kind of tradition, sort of a Baptist, if you will. But the love of this church and this community, he felt like he had to join this church, which he did in 2010, which was one of the most touching events of my life. A lot of people go around saying, what would Jesus do? This is a very important and a central question, I think. I often in my life have asked the question, what would Red do? And if Dad were here, his lasting message to us is just a few simple teachings that he lived by and that he urges us, and his living witness urges us to live by. Number one, love God with all your heart and all your mind. Dad never questioned his faith, as I mentioned. He was instilled by a powerful, holy mother, and he never questioned that. He never questioned the centrality of the Bible to the good, earnest, and moral life. He liked the King James Version of the Bible. In fact, he and I used to joke, and he would say, I like the King James. If it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. Of course, he knew Jesus did not write the King James, but that was his way of getting it. He knew that Christ was the only source of our redemption, the only source of our hope, and he lived around that. He believed in grace and reconciliation. He did not have an enemy in the world. When there was conflict, he resolved it. At work, at home, there were conflicts in our family. He always, to his dying day, tried to reconcile those people, and that's a great model for us in our life. He also believed in telling the truth, even when it was painful, and he never once departed from that view. I think his second teaching, and these aren't original to him, but he is such a powerful living witness of that, is follow the golden rule. Dad, the story we'll never know are the thousands of acts of kindness that he shared with other people. He loved humanity, regardless of who you were, your skin color, where you came from. One time, when I was a young teen, when I was 12 or 13, we were in a parking lot in Winston-Salem. It was at a Marita Bread clearance store. Dad liked to, he's a fairly frugal fellow, as his mom, and another witness for us to follow. And this fellow came up literally sort of out of, I don't really need to watch, but here's about 20 honey buns, some bread, and there's some other stuff. You just take that with you. You need it more than I do. And he gave that to that guy immediately. And there are many of these acts of kindness and love that define his life. The third teaching is really the love of neighbor, following the gospel. Dad loved everyone. He believed that loving, sharing, politics, society begins at home with your neighbor, not in the abstract. The abstractions always lead to confusion. And he gave that his kind of love. There are 4 types of love in the New Testament. The most serious, the most giving is the agape love, the self-sacrificial love. And that's the kind of love he gave throughout his life. And Mom and Dad's marriage is an example of that. Most of the examples of Dad's sharing will never be known because he was such a quiet person who had almost no ego. But when we were in Winston-Salem, in our house, we had a repair shop. And Dad would he repaired TVs, radios, and most of the time he would never charge anybody because he wanted to help them out. When we came here, we engaged in a sort of familial slavery of farming as much as we possibly could, especially gardening. And I was not particularly good at that. Rick wasn't particularly good at that, but Dad kept training us, and we weren't particularly trainable, were we, Rick? Right. He did that not to sell, but to give them away to his friends and to his neighbors, and many of us benefited from that. The next teaching is self-restraint, moderation in all things. Mom and Dad are a model of self-restraint. They did not buy a new car until 1968, and they bought a green station wagon, which the next morning after they purchased it, I tried it out as an 8-year-old and wrecked it, which I have been reminded of in the subsequent, 4 decades or so. Dad believed that excess equals distress. Possessions were unimportant to him. And by that, he gives us a model of how to live a good life. Lastly, Dad would say to us, laugh when you have the option between laughing and crying, and enjoy your life. Dad wanted to be a game warden when he was 18, but it was kind of a rough go, and he had to find a job, and he went to work at Western Electric. Dad was a world-class sportsman. I mean, he could have been an amazing bass professional. But most of the time you spent fishing with him, he was laughing at himself. And he laughed at anything bad in life. He was able to see the lighter side of it. For example, my brother, who's actually much smarter than I am, right there, spent part of a semester in college playing wiffle ball and the informal college system of intramurals. This is where you play the thing. Ricky was amazing. No one could hit Ricky's wiffle ball pitch, the plastic, very light balls. Ricky was amazing. He was the Nolan Ryan of wiffle ball. He won the campus championship. Rick got a nice plaque from Western Carolina University, put it on the wall. And I went by, a few months later, and I looked at that wiffle ball plaque, and Dad had made a little plaque to go below it. And it said, "This cost me $10,000. He led in a quiet, Christ-like way. And I'd like to read a brief